Good evening. Welcome to DiversiTV. I'm Mark Harris, and I'll introduce our guest for tonight shortly. If you are just tuning in, welcome. And I'll explain what DiversiTV is about. And if you're coming back to us, our growing legion of fans and audience, welcome back. DiversiTV, we're in our 5th season, and our mission is to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. We will divert a little bit from that tonight because our guest tonight does actually get the mic and the camera more than a lot of folks do. Our season basically roughly corresponds to LCC terms, and we usually start each term, each season, with a native perspective because we're on Turtle Island. Then because we speak English, an Anglo perspective, and then an African and American perspective. Next week is Latino. After that, day after the election, Asian. The week after that, the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, transgendered, and two-spirit perspective. Disability on the 19th, youth perspective, Thanksgiving week, and class, first week in December, and then we'll end this season with a discussion on spirituality and religion. And basically we mix and match the topics according to guest availability. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is the oldest non-indigenous civil rights organization in the world. Now what I mean by non-indigenous is that there were indigenous civil rights organizations here on Turtle Island fighting colonization. There were definitely Africans who were organizing on their behalf in maroon societies, but in terms of what we contemporarily recognize as a civil rights organization, it's the oldest one in the world. It's founded in a time when the term colored people basically referred to non-whites globally. Today the focus tends to be limited to a local, regional, and national context, and in local politics, the NAACP succeeded the Congress of Racial Equality in activism around issues of discrimination against people of color, stereotypically, though not exclusively, African Americans. The Eugene Springfield branch activities include ACSO, which is Academic, Creative, Technological, and Scientific Olympics for youth, back to school, after school educational support programs, civil rights legal action, and political and community organization. Our guest tonight, Henry Luvert, who's the president of the Eugene Springfield NAACP. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Hey, we tried to get you last season when we were putting together an Obama show after his appearance at the University of Oregon, and you reported to me then that you and your vice president, Rachel, were the only people of color to meet Obama in a hand-picked group, kind of like backstage, meet and greet VIP, which is interesting given that you two are not the only Democrats of color. And, it was kind of ironic. I was working crowd control. So tell me how that happened. What was that like?
Well, it was very interesting. We thought it was ironic that the only elected black official in all of Lane County didn't get invited, and we brought that up because we thought it was, in a way, rather disrespectful not to have a Lane County Commissioner, Bobby Green, invited. And people forget that he's a registered Democrat, and sometimes the local Democratic Party don't treat him like he's a Democrat. They seem like they always want to run against him for some reason. And they make up reasons. Even today's candidate that's running against them, they make up stuff. It just shows that you don't have to know anything about the position that you're running against the brother on. All you have to do is make up stuff.
Yeah, definitely seems to be an interesting pattern.
So, it's happened nationally too.
Yeah. So yeah, so what was it like meeting Obama?
He's a very mellow individual. He's not a physically large man. He's tall, but thin. And he'll tell you in a minute he's skinny. And I guess you would call him skinny compared to most of us.
Yeah.
And he seems to be very humble. He's just like what you see on television, just easygoing. And being from Chicago, he could relate to that. So, we kind of make the connections on what part of the city you're from, because Chicago is so large.
Yeah.
You designate a connection by, what part of the city you're from?
Right.
And that's the first thing people ask you, who from that area, because they know the dynamics and the cultural mixes are so different in different parts of the city. If you're on the north side, there's a cultural dynamics that's entirely different than the west side or the south side.
Yeah.
And when you say south side, somebody else from the west side, they know what that means.
When I visited Chicago, I've noticed that it's probably interestingly enough, one of the more ethnically segregated cities in America in terms of different neighborhoods, and maybe they mix, maybe they don't, but they have a definite character.
Well, Chicago, and when I grew up in Chicago, it was very, very segregated. That's where there was a lot of black block busting, where a black family would move in and people would get ultra violent and try and burn them out, and then all the white neighbors would leave that neighborhood within 6 months. And then they moved to the next neighborhood. It was really interesting thing to see as you grew up, and the dynamics. You knew what parts of town you wasn't supposed to be in.
Right.
And if you were black and you ended up in a white part of town at wrong times of day and night, your life was in danger, just like someone who was white who came into a black neighborhood. So it was very divided. Not as bad now. What I find interesting today is a lot of the all-black neighborhoods that I grew up with are now integrated, and they're actually turning back the other way. They're turning into white neighborhoods. And the suburbs, which were exclusively white, are now turning into islands of blacks, because they tore down all the projects. Well, you have to send the people somewhere, so they sent them to the suburbs as it got more expensive in gas and jobs and things of that nature. And a lot of the people from the suburbs moved back to the city where the projects were, and now they can catch the public transportation to work, or they can walk or ride their bike, whereas in the suburbs, it's a 30-minute drive to get back into the city. So those are some of the interesting dynamics of a place like Chicago. So
what made you come out here?
Well, you would have had to have grown up in Chicago to understand that. It's a desire to get out of that type of mindset environment. Right. I used to teach high school in Chicago, and it was the politics of high school there and education there is beyond anything anyone can comprehend here. And it's even worse now than it was when I was teaching there.
Politics how?
Well,
like, for example,
the inner city schools, if you were in a black school, you just didn't get the resources. I mean, as far as even track was concerned, I didn't play football because they had to tape the equipment together. You had to tape your pads so they wouldn't fall off of you.
Ooh, ouch.
Track, we couldn't even have certain events because we had no facilities for the kids to practice in. Okay. We had to pay for our own uniforms back then. We had to pay our own transportation to track meets. And you go to the suburban schools and you see how beautiful those schools were and the resources they had. It was striking. It was a humongous difference between what we were offered and what was offered out in the suburbs. And when you go back, you see that the discrepancy in the schools exists even today.
Yeah. So why Oregon?
I got accepted to the grad school at the University of Oregon.
Okay.
So I figured, hey.
All right. And you taught in 4J for a time, did you not?
Yeah, I did. And actually, I taught when George Russell his first stint in 4J. I actually got hired by George Russell.
As the AHR, which...
He worked in HR at that time.
Yeah.
And that was back in 1976, I think it was.
Yeah, under the Pesant
correct
era.
Who I actually got to see him again, Fazant.
Yeah.
I was in Boston at a conference on the achievement gap, which was very interesting because he got to speak at the conference, and having that connection between someone who's taught or was superintendent in the school district where you live now, and now he's a retired superintendent for the school district of Boston, says a lot.
Yeah. So contrast and compare not only the community but also the school district, because I mean you come from an urban school district where even though it might have been segregated, the ability to deal with different ethnicities and races was a given and a norm. And you come here to Eugene where you were aware of some of the history of Oregon where it's basically set up to be segregated.
I knew nothing about the state of Oregon other than it looked pretty.
Yeah.
And actually the dynamics of cultural understanding was in existence in Chicago as well. A white teacher in the classroom, I saw many white teachers ran out of the building simply because they didn't know how to deal with the students. And when I started teaching, I was 22, I had students 19. Well, I understood how to control them. I didn't have a control problem when I taught in Chicago. And when I came here, I didn't have a problem dealing with the kids because it's all in knowing how to relate to someone else. And growing up...
Talk about that some.
Well, a lot of the kids here culturally don't get a lot of diversity in cultural interaction with different people.
No.
And neither does the staff. So they misinterpret a lot of things. And a lot of times the kids of color are the ones that suffer simply because the teacher didn't know how to relate to them or the other kids didn't know how to relate to them. And it leaves the kids in this vacuum. They don't know who they are. And they have a lot of identity crises as they grow up. And some of them become severe. And within that identity crisis come a lack of self-confidence. And as that self-confidence drops, a lot of times their achievement drops right along with it. And then if you don't have a culturally competent teacher, they misinterpret maybe their disengagement as they're having learning disabilities.
Yes.
Or if they react certain ways, it's a discipline problem that they have. And a lot of times administrators and staff overreact. So you see a disproportionate amount of African American boys in particular who might get suspended. And this is across the country. It's not just here.
Yeah.
These statistics come up in all the conferences that I go to. And it's a big, huge problem because it's just not enough teachers of color that intermingle or get hired into these districts. And a lot of times you hear them say, well, we can't find people. We've referred people of color to the school districts. And a lot of times, like 4J, sometimes you have people in positions, they don't know how to hire a person of color. So they have these committees and they'll say, well, that he doesn't or she doesn't seem like they'll be a good fit here. Well, the whole screening committee was all white. And so there's some cultural dynamics they might not have picked up on, but they use that as their excuse. And then I hear people say, well, maybe they weren't the most qualified. Well, when I look at them on paper, if you go by what was on the paper, they were the most qualified. And
sometimes even overqualified.
Sometimes even overqualified. And the need for cultural diversity is not just for the kids of color, it's for the white kids as well. That's one thing I found out when I taught in 4J. The white kids appreciated me as much as I could appreciate them because I brought a whole different flavor and dynamics. I destroyed many stereotypes because they were hearing things at home that they found out weren't true because just their interaction with me, they found out, well, I don't fit that stereotype. It's just like you teach here. I'm pretty sure for the students that you run into for the first time, they're like, interesting.
Right.
A brother with dreads is my instructor.
Or even a brother as an instructor.
Period.
You know, it's quite frequent that I'm the first black person they've ever encountered in their entire career in Oregon.
And that's in college, so you can imagine
right.
the impact I had. I taught middle school here, and my wife has taught in the district for 30 years, and she still always get those type of reactions. And it's not just from the students. You get a lot of negative reactions from a lot of adults sometimes. Teachers get some very interesting negative comments from parents or from colleagues, because whites sometimes, not all the time, some people always feel that you got your job through affirmative action.
Yes, right.
And
meaning you were less qualified, which affirmative action actually has nothing to do with that.
No.
In fact, that kind of hiring under affirmative action is in fact illegal.
And the word affirmative action only means do something positive.
Right.
It doesn't mean, oh, go out and do something negative.
Right.
Affirmative action, just do something to remedy the fact that you've done nothing in the past to make this a diverse workforce or a diverse work environment. And that's what we fight all the time. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest problems that we have. And so the kids of color don't see role models. They don't see somebody that looks like them. And so it makes it very difficult for us to be able to say, you can become anything you want to become, which leads to what's happening nationally now.
Yes. So tell us about your the way you're addressing that with the back to school, after school program. What is that designed to do?
Well, it's actually the back to school, stay in school.
Stay in school. Okay.
And it's designed to help deal with the achievement gap, to help as many of the districts as possible. And right now we seem to have quite a bit of cooperation from the 3 major school districts in our area. That's Bethel, 4J, and Springfield. And we're almost at the end of the planning stage, and we hope to implement the program next month and do the kickoff in January. And what it's designed to do is to help kids really focus in on how important education is, set up tutoring for those kids who need tutoring, deal with some cultural aspects, some cultural training. And it's not just for African American kids, but that's who we would probably get a lot of, is a lot of African American kids, because right now and the Latino kids are the ones who are falling in the gap the most, along with the Native Americans and socially economic deprived kids.
Yeah.
And there's a correlation. I always make the comment that if you, and when I say you, I'm talking about a community, allows for something negative to happen in one community, it's going to be in yours pretty soon, because you allowed for something bad to fester and to grow. It's just like with the drug problem. It used to be it still is in our communities, but it seemed like no one wanted to do anything about it, and it just spread out like a cancer. Now it's everywhere. So we look at education. So if you don't do anything for the kids of color, pretty soon it's socially economic deprived. Then pretty soon it's going to be the next group, and pretty soon the whole educational system starts to pull itself down. It's almost like a black hole. It's next to impossible to get out. So all over the country they're trying to solve the problem of the achievement gap, and it's as if they don't know what to do. There are a lot of different things that can be done, but it's like a dog chasing its own tail. And the more they try the same thing, they find out that it still doesn't work. But let's change the name of it and try it a different way. And all you have to do is look at some of the curriculum that's being used. The curriculum's not effective, and it's not designed to be effective. If you look at the educational system, all over the country, the educational system, they'll tell you that out of 100 kids entering into the 9th grade, only 80 of them will not graduate from college. Only 20 will. So that means the educational system is designed for the 20%, not the 80%. And that's a statistic that holds almost all across the country. So it's almost designed to filter out so only 20% will graduate from college. And you say, well, why would that be? Well, you got to have somebody at the bottom, huh? You got to have somebody who can only be qualified to work at fast food stores and the low-paying jobs. So you set up a caste system within the educational system, and most people are oblivious to it. So you have to do that filtering out. You have to have somebody to fill the prisons. And if you look at who's in the prisons, in the adult prisons, most of those people are uneducated, whether they be black or white. Those are people who fell through the cracks in the system. Those are the ones who, 3rd and 4th grade, it was determined that they couldn't read that well or couldn't read at all. And so let's base our prison building system upon the failure rate there, because we know that they'll be our up and coming customers for the prison system. So if we know these things, and kids can go to prisons and the juvenile detention centers and they can get education, why did it take all that to educate some of them? And then what do? People at home, they're mad that maybe they might get an education. Well, let's not give them anything extra. We want them to serve their time. So prisons no longer become a place where people become rehabilitated. They go there to learn their craft, which is crime, which a lot of them become very good at, whether it be better drug making or whether it be better at breaking in your house.
Robbing or whatever.
Sure.
A lot of time, I mean, because we're both educators,
Sure.
right? So one of the things that I look at, just looking at my educational upbringing, son of a doctor and a school teacher, but our history, our family history, we, coming up in this, my parents coming up in the segregated South, basically taught themselves, have your own library at home. Don't, basically, public school was seen as a supplement to good home training. And good home training included a library card, the expectation that, you read the newspaper, stay up on civic events, and basically then get whatever you learned in school to be a supplement to that, so that your orientation towards education, you avoided whatever the achievement gap was, even to the degree that it existed then, which we called it the tracking system then.
Yeah, they had tracking when I was coming up. The difference was my parents didn't have an educational background. My mom was, the highest she had went was 8th grade, and she eventually got her GED.
From the South?
She's from the South. She's from Mississippi.
Yeah.
Father was from Alabama, and his was a 9th grade education. I was the first to graduate from college in my family, so that was, they didn't even know how to advise me in school, what to do or how to do, because they didn't have that kind of experience.
Yeah.
I just know that they didn't want me to come in with failing grades. I had encouragement not to bring those type of grades in, so I didn't. But at the same token, they didn't know how to push.
I hear the code in there.
Yes, the code is there.
Peach switch encouragement almost.
It was, you were highly motivated.
Yes, shall we say.
Yes, and so I was motivated. And through that motivation, even though it was small, they just didn't know how to push to get the most out of me. And so, you just kind of flow through because there's no push. And I grew up in the projects, so I saw a lot of people that fell off the sides. A lot didn't make it. I'd say probably about 95% of the people that I grew up with didn't make it, one way or the other. So you see a lot of different things. So when you come to a place like Eugene, you see a whole different dynamics. You see a different level of opportunities that you can do and your kids can get to. Now, I was strict when it came to grades. I was basically, they weren't allowed to even bring home C's. They brought home C's.
Your kids?
My kids could not bring home C's. They were grounded for the whole semester.
Ouch.
So
but
they all graduated.
The proof is in the pudding, right?
They all graduated. They graduated from the U of O, except for the youngest. He's at the University of Washington. And they all maintain 3 points and above as far as GPA, 3.7, 3.75, 3.8, 3.85. So, but I had high expectations. And that's one thing that a lot of people don't do with their kids today, is they have either low expectations or no expectations. So when a kid brings home a C because that's the best they did, they think that's good. And that's just mediocrity. And so we promote mediocrity throughout our relationship with our kids in most cases.
But you would agree, because it sounds like it happened in your family, where it's not enough to have a high expectations, you also have to have some degree of support to make those happen, even if that's only sanctions for low performance, right? But there's also educational support either at home or teaching you how to access those educational resources within the school, because they do exist. In some places you usually have to dig for them.
Yeah, but what I'm finding is the families that have the biggest problems are the ones who they don't know how to motivate or push their kids, because they were never motivated or pushed, and their kids are in most cases a mirror of how successful they were in the system. And usually I can tell when a kid is unsuccessful and you talk with the parents, they either don't know how to, or it's not an important issue to them because it wasn't important in their lives sent down through their parents. In other words, they don't know how to interact with the system, with the teachers, with the administrators, and so they avoid it. And that's why parents of kids of color, it's very difficult to get them involved. One of the reasons is the intimidation factor. People underplay that, but it's very important.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily underplay it, but as I guess in personal experience, it was a non-factor, because mom being a school teacher, when the 4th grade teacher said, "Stop teaching me how to read because I'm ahead of the class," no, we are not playing that, right? So even though I'm the 3rd person in my family to graduate from high school, and there was a high expectation that, oh, you're black, you're going to college, end of discussion.
Right. Well, it's just like my daughter, the one who lives in Florida. She's taught her daughter how to read, and she's reading at the 3rd grade level, and she's just 4 years old.
Okay.
And it's really amazing.
Preschool age, but 3rd grade level.
She's been reading since she was 4. She had in fact, she was reading before she was 4. And so I said, well, I have to videotape this, because this is just mind-boggling to hear her read and read words that are huge. I mean, these weren't see Dick and Jane, see Dick go up the hill. These were real words, and she knew how to sound them out. She knew how to do all the things and knew all the rules to reading. But my daughter spent the time with her. She taught her how to read, but she had the right tools. And she was using a curriculum, which I find really interesting. It was a curriculum that was developed by an educational researcher right here in Eugene. And he developed this curriculum in 1982 or 83, Zig Ziglar.
The motivational speaker?
No, Zimmerman. Actually.
Zimmerman, okay, okay, all right.
And he founded the National Institute of Direct Instruction.
Okay.
So direct instruction is what it is. And so I did a lot of inquiries, because it's like, wait a minute, this was developed in 1982. My granddaughter's just turned 4, and she's reading at the 3rd grade level. And my daughter said it helped her teach her how to teach her daughter. I said, well, how come they're not using this?
And your daughter's not a teacher.
Well, she's not a teacher, but she did get a degree in education.
Okay, all right.
So, but she wasn't taught how to do that.
Right, okay.
And so the curriculum actually showed her how to teach her daughter. And I said, well, how come this isn't widely used? And so what I found out is a lot of teachers don't like to use direct instruction, because they said, well, it gets boring to them.
Wait a minute, it gets boring to the teachers?
Yes, because
students like it, but it's boring to the teachers?
It's new to the student.
Okay.
Once the student has learned, they move on and they go to the next grade level. But you're still in kindergarten doing the same thing year in, year out. It becomes monotonous to them.
Yeah.
And so I guess they lose the joy of the fact that the kids are learning to read, and it's a new thing to them, but it's not to the teacher.
Okay.
So it becomes difficult for them after about 4 or 5 years because it becomes so mundane and routine to them. And my feeling is, but it's not about them.
Right.
And if they can come out of kindergarten reading, why is that such a bad thing?
Oh, well, maybe it isn't a bad thing, but I think that points out one of the issues around the so-called achievement gap.
Yes.
It's because, I've been to those conferences along with you.
Yep.
And so, the observation can be made, at least I've made it, is achievement gaps are engineered.
Exactly.
They are intentional.
I agree.
They're not accidental.
I don't think they are.
Whether it's a matter of teacher attitudes, tracking systems within the school, et cetera, it isn't the issue of the child arriving in a deficit position or not having family support for education. It's certainly not those things alone, but it's also something systemic within education as it's been delivered.
If it's been going on year in and year out,
Yeah.
and there are mechanisms in place that can mitigate some of that stuff, but they don't implement it because and I've taught, and I remember I taught electronics in Chicago. And by the 3rd year, I knew what page to have the kids turn to. I almost knew the words in each paragraph by heart. And it becomes a routine. And yeah, you can get stuck in that routine if you allow yourself. But it's up to the teachers to try and find ways to make it creative to themselves and still implement and deliver the curriculum to the child, because for that kindergartner, it's all new to them.
Yeah.
They can be excited by it. Whether the teacher is or is not the issue anymore. It's how well did they do their job in getting that kid to read and move to the next level. And when they go to the next level, build up on what they know and continue on. Because usually if they're still into education by the 3rd grade, and remember, a lot of our youth, the African American youth and Latino youth, by the 3rd grade, they're turned off to education.
Right.
And a lot of times we find that, and it's not a conscious effort all the time, that maybe a white teacher ignored the kids of color, but it happens. And it's devastating to those kids. And it's not to say all teachers do that. It's just that when it does happen, it destroys the confidence of that kid, because they might raise their hand but get ignored. And it happens. I get parents and kids telling me all the time that this happens to them. And it happens in very subtle ways sometimes. Maybe they're in the back of the classroom or the back of the line. Or it's subtle little things. They know that they're different. They look different. They're the only kid of color in the classroom.
Right.
And other kids come up to, oh, you look like chocolate milk. Right. And that's an innocent
Does it rub
thing.
off? Can I feel your hair? Yeah.
Those are the type of things that a kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grader does not understand. And the teacher doesn't understand the importance of that. It's just like a lot of times you'll see kids who are adopted by a white family, and I can always tell that family, they love that child, but they don't necessarily know how to care for that child. The child's hair is not combed, and not knowing what kind of imprints that might make on that child, especially if it's a young girl or even a young boy. Lint in their hair, and their skin is dry. All the things we know as a culture, things that we would have addressed,
right,
that aren't being addressed.
That's part of home training.
Exactly.
So,
but if you don't know, you don't know what you don't know.
Right. And I guess the only way to safely put this, not that we're afraid of generating in controversy here, is that dealing with different forms of discrimination is a skill. You can acquire it if you weren't raised with it.
Right.
But, one of the assumptions is, that often, especially, when, people acquire kids, buy kids, adopt kids, whatever, the nomenclature is, it's like, okay, I'm going to do my part, to help humanity, but not necessarily knowing how to deal with the everyday experience that kid experiences,
Exactly.
And the kid might not even tell them.
They don't.
You know, if it's a white parent or non, you know, whatever color it is, because this happens, you know, cross-racially in terms of looking at those issues. I mean,
Well, they don't know how to communicate that with their parents.
Right.
I mean, we run into kids, even in the high school, they can tell you stories about how they feel and how they felt. High school kids, young lady who said she tried to rub the brown off because she felt so intimidated by the fact that she was different than everybody else. And she wanted to become like everybody else because they are treated differently. Or you'll find, you can talk to kids who can pass as white, and they'll say in a minute that they're white, simply because they know they'll be treated differently and better. And you say, better how? Well, they won't be the one that's questioned. They won't be the one who's picked out when something's missing, or they won't be the one who's suspected of doing the wrong thing. Or in a crowd of 10 kids, if something went wrong, they're the ones who spot it first, and they're the ones who might be suspected first to be the one who did whatever was wrong. So they see that there's a difference being white and non-white. And they'll opt to be white whenever they can, if they can, simply because they know that being a person of color is akin to being treated as a second-class citizen. And no matter how we look at it, even when we look at the election, and here in the state of Oregon, we may not have that issue, but I've been to other
less.
Or less. There'll
less
be
overt.
some.
Yeah, right.
You run into some people anywhere who say, well, I can't vote for him because
he's black.
Right. But
anyone but a nigger syndrome.
Yeah.
To be blunt.
In other parts of the country, what I found out that there are people who, they don't hide that kind of mindset.
Nope.
And there are parts of this country that are so racist, it's mind-boggling.
Yes.
And people here don't necessarily see it because it's more subtle here. But I get as many complaints about how people are being treated on the job here as any place else. Talk
about some of those things without necessarily revealing the organization.
Well, you have, usually what it is how they're being treated by other employees.
Yes. Okay.
Or sometimes how they're treated by supervisors. I get people calling me saying, well, and if they are a supervisor of color, they really run into a lot of problems because it's really a mind thing for whites to actually take instructions or orders from a person of color. And a lot of times it's so ingrained they're not even conscious of it because we are brought up to believe that white is superior to all others. The history books drum that into you. The culture drums it into you. When you look at television, you see that. You look at our governments and stuff. You see that it's drummed in that in order to be the best, you would have to be white. And no matter what you do and how much you achieve, every person of color that I know, especially African Americans who get into a position of authority, they all have the same story. They know and run into those people who resent them being their boss only because of the color of their skin.
Only, right. So whether we've had, and I'm not going to mention the organization, but I know you know who we're talking about. Well, since they're one of the organizations that signed the MOU where somebody says, quote, I ain't taking orders from a nigger, and that is the verbatim quote, right? And we've, just to be fair, in the interest of fairness, okay, we've had that exact comment, though not as blatant, here, where it is a white U of O trained faculty member telling a black manager that the reason that he resisted his educational initiatives is because he's an African American. So even if it's in that kind of academic language, it's still, I ain't taking orders from a nigga. Well, even if that nigga has better degrees and more experience than me.
Well, my experience is that it's in every one of the organizations and agencies. That mindset is there. It's at different levels with different people. If you got 1,000 people in your agency, you better believe that there's some that still think like the old days, because that's what they reminisce on. And they have those type of mindsets because that's what they were taught from their parents and their grandparents, that they were superior and people of color are inferior. And you can go to different parts of the state. If there ain't none of us there, somebody else will be the nigger in the community. It might be the Native Americans down in K Falls.
The prairie niggers.
And everybody's got that mind. People have that mindset. Someone's got to be on the bottom. And I don't understand that mindset, because when you put somebody on the bottom, that means somebody's on top of you.
Right.
And those are the type of things that we run into. So when you hear of the MOU, and that's the Memorandum of Understanding on we will do and promote diversity in our workforce and how we interrelate and stuff like that.
That is the Memorandum of Understanding between the 12 largest public employers, which include City of Eugene, City of Springfield, the University of Oregon, Lane Community College, all 3 school districts, EWEB, LTD, Lane County, etc.
City of Eugene.
City of Eugene, too, yeah.
And
City of Springfield, yeah.
Right. And what happens is it's signed, but there's not a lot of action behind once it's signed.
That's your observation.
Well, yeah. I mean,
right.
if you were to look, not a lot changes. Now, we're working with EWEB now to try and implement some changes, and we're going to see how well that works out.
Can you talk about what that is?
Well, what we're doing is setting up study circles around race.
Okay.
Because that...
Carrying on the work that, like, the City Club, for example, started.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
What we're finding out a lot of times, the things around white privilege has to be discussed, because most whites don't even know what that is, because they've had it all their lives.
And it's white scholars that came up with the term. We didn't make it up.
No, I know. But once they acknowledge it, it's okay. We can talk about it all day long, and people will say, no, it doesn't exist, but it will require that someone that looks like them or looks white says it. And then that validates it.
Yeah.
So the conversation, what it does, it opens up the dialogue around race. And it's very interesting, because what happens is you have a lot of people who never had that conversation. And since they never had the conversation, they never had to address issues about some of the prejudices that they have, or some of the racism that's latent within their bodies. But it comes out, and it's a good thing, because now they find out how it makes and how it impacts upon other people. Because now they're in a conversation with somebody who, what they did, they find out the results and consequences of some of those actions. And the ones I've been in have been very interesting, simply because it doesn't matter how conservative or liberal you are, you harbor some of those same mindsets. And actually I found out...
I mean, as black men in this culture speaking English, we harbor some of those mindsets because it's embedded in the language, and we have to kind of like fight, that double thing. That's, the double consciousness that Du Bois talked about.
Right. Well, in a way, we have to be multicultural to survive in this society, whereas the dominant culture, wherever you are, does not necessarily have to understand any of the other cultures within that society, simply because everyone has to come up to their level. Otherwise, they don't get the jobs, they don't get the opportunities, and so you have to blend in. Well, it's very difficult for someone dark like me and you to just blend in.
Right.
It doesn't happen quite that easy. And so no matter what room I'm in, I can declare that I'm a white man, but no one will believe me. And I've actually made that comment sometimes. I am a white man.
Huh? What?
Well,
Henry Luvert saying that?
Don't you believe me?
Well, okay, for example, and I regret that the paper bag that I usually use to illustrate this, so, the paper bag test, okay? So whiteness isn't just relegated to simply white people.
No.
It's, can you pass the paper bag test? So take an ordinary grocery shopping bag, where you can still find them, and put your skin up to it. So if you are darker than that paper bag, you cannot pass for white. If you're lighter than that paper bag, you can. Now this basically is a little code, a little test that came out of the apartheid South.
Well, part of that, though, the paper bag test was more in our community than it was in the white community.
Right.
Because even if you passed the paper bag test, if you looked like you still had some black in you, you still couldn't come into...
A little dip in the inkwell. Right.
That's right. Well, you figure Obama is 50% white, and they still call him a black man.
Right.
And
so he can't pass the paper bag test. Right.
And they don't even say he half white. No, he black.
Right. Right.
And I always find that interesting. He's half white, but he's black. Now, anybody who looks white, and one parent is black and one parent is white, he's white. So it's all a perception, isn't it? Has nothing to do about anything.
And it's not only just perception. I mean, they're basically what the whole concept of whiteness and white privilege, you know, and when we've had speakers and people, guests on the show that have talked about that. But, you know, one salient example is immigration policy with respect to Cuba. So, for example, 1/3 of Cubanos are African, or they can't pass the paper bag test. And so there is a feet wet policy, so that if you're a light-skinned Cuban and you make it to Florida, you get to stay, right? But if you're a dark-skinned Cuban, you get deported as if you were Haitian. Same island, but you know, different races and different racial appearances get treated differently by policy.
Well, if anybody knew about the history of Cuba, they'll know that the black Cubans were treated just as bad as black folks in the South by the Euro-Cubans.
Yes, the Castilian Spaniards.
Right,
yes.
True. And the thing is, we have this misconception that, in fact, a lot of Americans were surprised when they start seeing the black Cubans come on the boat. And what they doing there? Well, I always say the bus stopped there first before it got to the United States, and they got off, and master spoke Spanish, so they speak Spanish. That's all. I always tell people that they'd say, well, just call me black. That's just a description. That tells nothing about your heritage. Now, you can be African, Cuban American, and that tells me something about your heritage, doesn't it? As me, as far as I know, I'm African American, so my heritage, I'm pretty sure I got some peppers and salts all sprinkled throughout, Native American, some everything else, as we've been here over 200 years. So there's a lot that get mixed in, but it wasn't enough to make me look white. So when people see me, they see me as black visually, but I came from somewhere. My heritage comes from Africa, ergo African American. Yours came from Europe, you'd be European. And then you run into the white South Africans. Well, I'm African. But you would be European African American. It tells me something about your heritage, because they were not indigenous to South America. Black folks, South Africa. Black folks are not indigenous to Cuba. The natives were indigenous, and they're all dead. The ones that were there.
Not all of them, but yeah, most of them.
Well, I've never met a Native American from the Caribbean.
Well, they're Taino still.
And you got to get a magnifying glass to find them.
They are definitely subsumed, but they are definitely around.
And so you look at those things and you have to know, well, who was indigenous here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we might have colonized, or we might be here now, but we weren't indigenous.
Yeah.
What happened to the indigenous people? And that's where you always know, where did you come from if you weren't indigenous, or your family tree was not indigenous to that land? So
here you have been a firefighter, teacher, contractor, independent businessman in the community. So what would you say to a newcomer of color about how to persist here, given the history of the place?
Well, coming from a place like Chicago, there is no place in this country you can go and not escape racism. It's everywhere.
Really?
For real. So here is no different, except here you're isolated. It's you and it. Mm-hmm. It being the racism. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a place like Chicago, I can hide from it, because I have a community of hundreds of thousands of other black people who are around me. So we as a community absorb the racism, but I individually don't necessarily run into it.
Unless it individually focuses on you in those places where you're vulnerable.
Exactly. If I go to a store, and even back in Chicago, I was back there for 6 months last year, and what I found interesting was how the service levels change depending upon the community you're in. If I was in an all-white community, the stores and the people working in stores were friendly, the stores were clean, in the grocery stores, the food was appealing. You go into the black community, the floors were filthy, the service was lousy, they had you scan coming in and going out, and the thing is, you ask, well, why is that? And you had all kinds of reasons or excuses. There'd be bars on the doors and things of that nature. And the people steal from you. Well, we found out it was the employees stealing from them.
Not their patrons. Yeah,
right. And patrons steal from in every way. I mean, there's theft here in Eugene. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a Lane County jail. And so, you just run into those dynamics.
What are some of the issues that you've found your children facing in schools, in the community, and when and if they've moved away? Like, for example, we're sitting in Greg's office talking about Man's experience. Going to Chicago, going to Northern Illinois, and, his experience there. Growing up here in Eugene and going away.
His experience was different because he was into sports, and so he was treated differently. He was treated like a sports person would be treated. And so, he interacted with his white teammates differently than the girls did. I mean, the age right.
Yeah.
The age differences are there's at least 13, 14 years between the oldest and the youngest. So when the oldest was coming through, it was a lot different when they competed like in Roseburg and Grants Pass. They were actually harassed.
Yes.
They got their hair pulled. They were called names. Well, that was not 50 years ago.
Well, that still goes on at Roseburg and Medford, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Even last year with South.
And so those things go on, and people like to pretend that they don't, but they do. And the dynamics that it impacts upon your children varies from child to child. Because they had high expectations of them, they had to fight through a lot of that stuff. And they became leaders in their day. They were either class president or student body president, or they were leaders as they went through school. They weren't followers per se. So it affected them differently, even though they understood who they were, and they had to have an understanding of who they were. And they had role models in both me and my wife. So it wasn't like I was absent. So they didn't have an absentee father.
Right.
I wasn't a sperm bank for somebody.
Right. And their parents were both educators with the expectation in terms of, let's say you got to speak the king's English better than the king, know the king's history better than the king.
Yeah, and what happens when they go back to a black community, like when they go back to Chicago to visit relatives, they would always be accused of sounding white. Oh, you sound white. And it's like, well, what does that mean? What is that? And I always would ask the kids, so what does that mean, sounding white? That means that they actually pronounce their words properly.
In newscaster English without an accent. Right?
Exactly.
Right.
And so like on the phone, they never get...
They can't be profiled as being black.
No. Because they don't have the accents.
Black, but you don't sound black.
And so like with me, I haven't lost all my accents, so somebody can hear me on the phone, and I've had them say, they know.
Yeah, right.
And white, black, they still know.
Yeah.
Whereas my kids, they don't know.
So, you can raise your kids to excellence, and they can, be leaders, but it's often lonely at the top, because in one sense, your people, whoever that is, besides the larger humanity, don't accept you because you sound like, those folks. And then those folks, you're clearly not white, but you're not like the black people that we know, that we expect.
And it puts our kids, when they go to other communities, sometimes in the middle. because they don't necessarily know where they fit in.
Yeah.
And that's the identity crisis that can happen. A lot of times they can grow out of that or beyond that and feel good about who they are, and sometimes they don't.
Final thoughts?
And on which one of the subjects?
Oh, anything.
Well, it's just interesting. I just wish more people would become more conscious and want to find out about different people and different cultures, and find out what people are about before they draw their stereotypes. I hear people who are doing stereotypes of China. Well, have you ever been? They'll say, well, no. Well, I've been. They're people just like the people here. They love their families. They love their children just like we do. They want to go to work and earn a living. And same thing in Japan. They love their children. They love their families. And you go any parts of the world, people love their children, love their families. People are no different anywhere. And we need to really investigate that.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. We'll have to leave it there. If you like what you've seen, tell a friend and email us at liveclass@lanecc.edu. Put DiversiTV in the subject line, and tell us what you'd like to see, and tell us what you liked or didn't like, and tune in next week. Haven't booked the guest yet, but this has been DiversiTV. Go well, stay well.